So one thing you'll encounter with audio sources in Unity is once you've added one to a game object, you might think, oh, okay, that green cube, it should have the twinkly magic sound, and also it should have a sound of like hitting the ground when it bangs into the ground. So you might at first think, let's just add another audio source, but alas, you cannot. If I drag the fall sound over to our game object, it will just replace the audio clip in the one existing audio source. So what that means is if you want a particular object to be able to play more than one sound, we have to use a different strategy. As it turns out, this can be useful because sometimes we want certain sounds, like sound effects that are going to get triggered a lot of times. We want to be able to sort of play those without necessarily worrying that we're going to stop the sound and restart it every time. This is really common with like, I don't know, like gunshots or things like that, where you're like, I'm still hearing the sound of the last shot while I should already be hearing the next one. I don't want it to like stop the wave file and start it up again. So there's a function for that in Unity called play one shot. And what's nice about play one shot is it can play a different clip than the one that's assigned to the audio source. So to demonstrate this, we're going to do our grab cube, and since we're carrying it around, we're going to give it a sort of realistic ability to bang into stuff, and if it collides with certain things, it's going to make a sound. So we've got to do this one through code because it's not going to be part of the XR grab interactable events, since it's not a hover or a select or anything like that. This is just a collision with other colliders in the game world. So we're going to have to code this one. So in scripts, we're going to right click, create, and make a new C# script. And mine's going to be called play on collision. And here is play on collision. So what this does is it looks for a variable, an audio source, and then we name that variable audio source. It looks for an audio clip, which if you're back in Unity, that's just like when you're on an audio source, its first variable is also an audio clip, So in this case, though, it doesn't have to be the same clip because that's the whole advantage of using play one shot. And then the one other thing that play one shot needs is a volume setting. This is just required for this function, and it takes a certain kind of number called a floating point number, or just a float. That means it can have decimal points. So we're going to make a public float that we'll call volume. And then on collision enter, which is a little bit different than on trigger enter. This is any kind of collision. There is going to be a collision that we'll call collision. And if collision's game object tag is some particular thing which I've made up called ground, then we're going to address the audio source component and play one shot, just play one time, this clip at a certain volume. And all of these things are things we get to set in the inspector. So if we go back to Unity and drag play on collision to our grab cube object, we have to hook up our variables. So I'm going to set my volume at 0.5. Grab cube will be the audio source because it has an audio source on it. And then we get to pick a different clip, which is great because we don't want to just trigger magic glitter. We want to trigger fall in this case. And then because we made the variable public, if you wanted your volume to be higher or lower, you would just change the number anywhere between 0 and 1 on this volume variable. The one last thing we need to set up is this ground tag. And the reason that is in the code is if you don't check for any tag at all, every single collision will trigger this sound. So that's a collision with the hand trying to pick the object up. It's the collision that's probably going to happen on the way out when the hand lets go of the object, but it hasn't even hit the ground yet. It's the collision when the object goes into the socket. It's every collision. So we want particular collisions. We want collisions with things that are the ground. There's basically three types of things that I would like to consider the ground. I could call it something different. I guess I could just call it solid or something like that, but I chose to call it ground. So this thing is ground. But the other things that I should probably treat as ground are the yellow cubes, and then like really I guess the walls of the room should be ground as well, because if somebody really wants to throw this thing across the room, it should probably sound like it hit the wall when it hits the wall. I've already hooked this up, but I'll backtrack and show you how it's done. On any game object that you click over here in the inspector, there is a tag. And by default, there's just these ones. Ground isn't one of the default ones. So I created this one. And the way I did it was by clicking add tag, and then you hit plus, and then you give it a name. So I already made one called ground. If I select ground and make it go away, it'll be mad at me because I've got other objects that are already tagged ground, but you get the idea. If I hit plus and made like a ground 2, then I hit save. Now I can tag things as ground 2 if I want to, but I'm gonna delete ground 2 because I don't need it. Now we would go to the plane, the blue plane, which we've called floor, and I will tag it ground. Go to each of the yellow cubes, tag them ground, and then also all of the stuff that constitutes the wall and ceiling, tag that ground. And so that way, when we pick up the cube and then drop it, we get a little thud on the ground. Get a thud there, and we should get a thud over here too. Yeah, hit the wall and the ground. 2 thuds.